share a bit of my thinking with you. No, I'll start over. Nadia, thanks for inviting me, and it's good to be here and have some time with the class. As you mentioned, I have a bit of a relationship with the University of Guelph. I'm not originally from here. I grew up in Northern Ontario and spent much of my life in Toronto, and I moved here 4 years ago. And I've known Brandon Stewart for a long time, sort of through collaborations in Toronto, getting to know Action and others on the faculty. So it's to keep, deepening the relationships and getting to know more people in the community. As you may have heard, I'm doing another talk in a couple of weeks on March 21st that is really going to be focused around community engagement, or the communication design side of community engagement. Basically, how to take like jargony processes like urban planning or sometimes even landscape architecture and make those more accessible and inclusive for folks to participate in processes, and really bringing the lens of communication and storytelling and graphic design into that. So knowing that that's coming up, I didn't want to do a repeat of that talk in the class today, so I came up with something unique just for you. And this talk I'm calling Graphic Possibilities, Visual Storytelling to Communicate Ideas for Places. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Downsview runway specifically. I'm not as grounded in that site as you are, but I want to kind of offer a bunch of things that are adjacent to these topics around branding, communication design, publication layouts, which I think is relevant for how you present your panels or your document, and kind of how these themes of like communication and branding connect to themes around placemaking and wayfinding, and really like building a sense of what's possible for a place. Now that's a very ambitious set of topics to cover, so I'm not trying to go very deep on any particular one of them. It's more just to offer a sprinkling of projects, of points of inspiration, of points of reference, things to think about. And then I'm also happy to have some conversation at the end. So just a little bit more about me. Nadia mentioned I'm based here in Guelph, traditionally known as Tidi Nadone. When I learned about that Indigenous name for Guelph, I thought that was really cool because the translation like loosely translates to where they build cities. And that was really special to me because like I identify as a city builder, and I like to think of my life in Guelph as not just being like not just like happening to live here, but being really intentional about the world that I'm building here and the community that I'm building. And the fingerprint, the influence that I'm having with my fingerprint on the city. Just yesterday, my work was featured at Guelph City Council, the community poll, where they were deliberating on the new Vision Zero action plan from the city, which essentially has to do with how to make our streets safer for people, especially for vulnerable road users like walking or people walking or biking or rolling. And I've been working as a consultant with the city on this project for several months. So it was really nice to see that at City Hall yesterday. Broadly, I consider myself a communication strategist and designer, although my roots educationally are really in graphic design. I've spent my whole career on the intersection of design, social change, and city building projects. Currently working independently, but I'm going to be joining an urban planning firm in a couple weeks. So kind of on a trajectory of like further deepening my work into this realm. The little RGD behind my name just signals it's kind of like OALA. It's kind of the equivalent in my field. It stands for Registered Graphic Designer. So it just speaks to a certain certification that I've reached in commitment to ethics and best practices in the field. And by the way, if you're wondering who these cute people are in this picture, these are my kids, River and Sparrow, and my partner, Bronwyn, and our family vehicles. So what's a graphic designer talking? Why is a graphic designer talking to landscape architecture students? One, I think that as designers, regardless of like what the hat is that we wear, there's a lot to offer if we think of things in an interdisciplinary approach. I think you'll notice that in the examples that I shared today. I'm going to start with some that are a bit more oriented towards like the branding end of the spectrum and publication design, but I'm also going to show you things from the landscape architecture and urban planning fields that I think are relevant. All these things are connected, and I think like we can really elevate each other's work. The more practical answer of like why me, why now is throughout my whole career as a graphic designer, I've done a lot of collaboration with urban planning firms, with landscape architecture firms across Canada and United States. So just like some of those firms I've partnered with are O2 Planning and Design, ERA Architects, Dillon Consulting, Sustainable, Shift Landscape Architecture based here in Guelph, Public Work, DKH, and the agency Landscape and Planning based in Massachusetts. So been grateful to collaborate on some of these folks with like projects that are out there in the world, Some of these other folks are those that I've teamed up with on proposals or design competitions that have not quite seen the light of day. So that's a bit of my background and the perspective that I'm bringing. So what I'm going to cover, I'm going to show 4 different projects I've worked on, just some relevant highlights that are kind of around some of these themes that I mentioned. I'm going to show you 5-ish examples from the field, more broadly like the landscape architecture and urban planning field, especially thinking about document design. So when you're doing your layouts, what are some considerations around fonts and colors and images and how you balance all these things and composition and grids? So I'm going to like walk you through a few of those with some, what are the things that I notice when I look at those things? I'm not going to tell you today how to build your document or how to design your award-winning piece. It's more like, here's a sprinkling of what's out there, some things to think about. So along with that, just some graphic design considerations for when you do come to doing your own layouts. And then have some Q&A. So as I mentioned, like the purpose today is really to offer some things to think about as you develop your ideas for the runway at YZD design competition, and consider how to visually tell the story behind your idea and the possibilities that you see. So starting with some project highlights, my asterisk here is that with some exceptions, most of these projects I'm going to show you are really collaborations between me and past team members and collaborators. So give me credit, but don't give me too much credit. Everything I do has been part of a great team. In my previous roles, as Nadia mentioned earlier, I founded a design studio called Rally Rally. And after many years of that, we merged that studio into another larger creative agency called Brightweb. So in kind of that joint chapter of my career, we did a lot of work with my team around branding, web design, campaigns, and publications. Those are kind of like broadly 4 main buckets of work if you think about deliverables from a graphic design and communications perspective that I've worked on. The first project I want to show you is a branding identity I did with the Friends of the West Toronto Railpath. I want to be clear, this is the Friends, which is kind of like the community organization that is advocating for the stewardship and development of the railpath in the West End of Toronto. It's not necessarily the like city's branding package because it is ultimately a city public space. Who's been to the railpath before? Feel free to give a little wave or drop an emoji. All right. So it's a really interesting space near the junction in the West End of Toronto. As the name suggests, it's a linear public space. Yes, it goes behind Mocha and Henderson Brewery, but it's like also it's a pretty long stretch, basically from Dupont down. Eventually, it's supposed to go to like Parkdale in the south end. Right now, it doesn't go quite that far. It kind of stops around College Street, Dundas, Lansdowne area. But it basically, this linear public space follows these train tracks, and it's a kind of industrial, gritty area. And what I love about the space is it's kind of wild. It's not trying to be overly manicured, even though it's it's a linear. One of the most famous examples, of course, you would all know the High Line in Manhattan. This is linear. That's kind of about and there's trains involved, but like beyond that, like it's a very different kind of feeling. Like it's really wild. It's a bit more like you're feeling like you're on the edge of town. It's more of like a pause from the chaos rather than like having a perspective on the chaos and traffic around you. So when this space was developed, I had no part in kind of what this orange bridge ended up looking like. When it was brought in by the Friends of West Toronto Railpath, I was like, well, what's here that I can build upon to build a little identity for the organization? So there was this bridge that had been painted orange where the path crosses over the 4 lanes of traffic. There was like a bit of an industrial vibe to that typography. The signage that was done on Corten was like, it had that look of aged iron material, stenciled letters, which is I believe a reference to the industrial nature of that area. You would still see in some of these buildings like stenciled paint from a long time ago, where you can imagine the trains going by you with like stenciled things on them. And just if the case this isn't obvious, the YZD identity also has stenciled letter. If you look at think of that blue logo, right? So there's something common here: the aviation history, the train history. This stenciled industrial typography is a motif you'll come across often when dealing with spaces like this. So I was like, okay, here's some of the things I can build upon. And there's also like a lot of life and color. It's not just like gray and orange. There's also like yellow, there's goldenrod, there's all kinds of different plants that I'm sure you could name better than I can that are like filling this space in all different times of year. So what I come up with for the visual identity here, West Toronto Rail Path, there's a version of this that says Franza West Toronto Rail Path. I used a industrial looking typeface with that stencil shape, but also like the stencil gaps are like not too big. So you can actually zoom out on this and it's still fairly legible. There's also a version that doesn't have those stencily gaps. So it's more solid. So if you're scaling down the smaller type, it's still legible. I took the stem of the R and turned that into train tracks. That's kind of it. White and orange as the base. And then beyond that, adding in accent colors like dark gray to really bring out industrial nature. When it came to building the website, I used a simple messaging connecting West Toronto, and then did a lot of like pairing words with beautiful images that sort of give you a sense of the space at different moments of people enjoying the activity space. And then as part of like showing what's possible, I mocked up a bunch of things that haven't necessarily been implemented in real life, but it's part of the thinking around the graphic identity. How can you take this foundation and run with it and do lots of different things? So on the left, you see a mock-up of an Instagram grid where you see a lot more like accent colors come in that reference a lot of the flora of the area. Kind of a combination of these like very bold graphic text statements with more immersive photography. And on the right is a mock-up of like what a mural could be if you took this R logo and put it in all kinds of different colors of the brand palette and then made a tile pattern out of it. So I wanted to share that off the top as an example of like how to create a graphic identity referring to the industrial heritage of a space. This next example I'm going to show you is totally different, and this is more about publication design, how to do a beautiful book layout. Most recently with my team at Brightweb, we were partnering with Community Forests International, which is a nonprofit based out of Atlantic Canada and East Africa. And they work with communities on the stewardship of forests for the purposes of like conservation and sustainability and economic development kind of all together. And they wanted to create a forest care guidebook that would essentially be targeted at people who own small woodlots in the Acadian forest, traditionally known as the Wabanaki forest. And rather than just saying like, ultimately the strategy here is to build relationships and cultivate like connection between woodlot owners and their land, their forests. So they don't just like go sell off that land and have it clear cut. And so rather than saying, hey, don't sell your land, we created this forest care guidebook that helps people connect with the land, with the forest at different times of year. So we called it Into the Wabanaki. What I want to show you from a graphic design perspective is how we brought in the brand's color palette, really being dark green and yellow and white. Brought in some other more softer natural colors through that palette. And then also use photography in a really intentional way. The pacing of photography with text, having moments of like really bringing you into the details of the forest at different times of year, experiencing the plants, the wildlife. The book's content itself is kind of poetic. It really prompts you to go out and like smell nature and spend time there with your kids and your family, your friends. And one of the things you'll notice on the image on the left is each chunk of the book has a different color along the edge. And so that refers to different seasons. And so, for example, spring, that whole section of the book has this coral pink edge. And so if you're looking at the edge of the book, the way it's printed, you'll see that. It's kind of like a subtle leaf lining device. Then that becomes an accent color through that whole section. And each season would have its own kind of divider pages and color system like that. Again, here's a look of combining these moments of like really immersive photography with like a bit of white space, in this case, green space. We call it white space in design, where there's a spot to rest your eye. Don't pack it all the time. It gives the content room to breathe, a spot to rest your eyes as you're turning the pages. And then to get into it, you'll see some larger text headings, some smaller text, some little like icons to call out certain things that you can do. Photography used sometimes full bleed across the page, sometimes just along the edge, sometimes kind of in the middle of the content. And here's the social media series that went along with it. Again, this is kind of like zooming out, abstracting the content of the book. You can think of it how there's these moments of photography on their own, moments of photography paired with text, and then moments of text only on a solid background. So creating a bit of a toolkit like this might be an approach that you consider for your document as well. This one's going to take a bit of a different turn. So my professional association, as I mentioned, RGD, the Association of Registered Graphic Designers, every few years they have the Social Good Design Awards, which prompts designers to submit their projects for celebration, for consideration of the work they're doing around social causes, whether it's health, environment, human rights, education, and so on. So they invited my team to design the identity for most recent. This picture over my shoulder comes from that. So we did the identity and advertising campaign. We really leaned into a vibrant color palette. This was circa 2021. Things have been pretty heavy in the last couple of years leading up to that. We felt like people needed a little bit of joy. We created this animated scout called Sogo. Sogo, they are always on your side, cheering for you, this like globe dancing and celebrating you. And then Sogo becomes this featured character through all the materials. And then we took So Good, which refers to social good as part of the name. And we translated So Good into about 15 different languages, including Anishinaabe, Moan, which you see in the bottom left there. And that was really meant to help this reach a more global audience by, connecting different languages. And so part of the decision there was upfront when we were choosing our fonts, identifying how many different languages we wanted to use, making sure those fonts were going to work with all the alphabets that we needed. Here's an example of how the campaign rolled out on posters. The actual physical awards, they are made from plastic salvaged from the ocean. So these are old plastic bags and fishing nets pulled out of the ocean. Another kind of way of making it full circle, rather than just having like random plastic or wood or something produced for the project. So again, trying to make this a bit relevant for what you're thinking about. How can you consider materials and even the ways that you display your work, reinforcing the message of your ideas? And then when it comes to the publication side of things, this is the awards catalog. It's about 100 pages. It shows the winning projects. It shows, it has little like essays and thought pieces and interviews. You'll notice looking at these pages kind of zoomed out, there's a difference in hierarchy. It's like not every page is treated the same. There's moments where you're really kind of invited to pause and like take the time to read. There's others where it's just like a kind of a moment of graphic punctuation, where you turn the page and there's like Sogo like big and yelling at you, or like big things that say good words, right? And even contrasting color. So think about the rhythm and pacing as it goes through this document, whether they're doing it on their own or whether you're flipping through in a slideshow. How can you bring some rhythm and pacing so that it doesn't get too monotone? And here's a close-up of some of the details of the printed book. Actually, in the corner of the book, it's like a little flip book animation. So if you grab the corner of the book and you flip through it really quickly, you'll see Sogo, the character, doing a little dance with you. So it's a way of kind of taking video, or what would be a video, and converting it into a print format. This last project I want to show from my own portfolio is a project we did with the City of Windsor in partnership with Dillon Consulting. So it was a transit master plan, essentially looking at, as Windsor is growing and evolving, how can we update the transit system in terms of its service, in terms of the bus routes, to better serve the needs of the city. So while my friends at Dillon focused on the transit planning and data side of things, we supported the community engagement process with a dynamic communications campaign to draw attention and making sure we weren't only appealing to people who were already riding the bus. Yes, we have bus shelters where people were riding the bus, but we also had messaging and advertising materials that were citywide that helped to make transit relevant to people. I want to highlight that word relevant. In your own projects, you can be thinking about how do you make this thing relevant to whoever the audiences are. And so in our case, we talked about transit being more than just going from point A to point B. It's really like, that's not why someone goes on transit. It's about where they're going. What does it unlock for you? It helps you get to work, to school, to the hospital, to see friends, and so on. So we developed this messaging around shape transit, shape our city, and saying we're looking at more than transit. So there's a picture of the bus zooming by, a bus shelter, but I want to kind of step back and break down how we got here. On the left is the Transit Windsor logo. The pink highlights I just added on my own to kind of point out a few things. As part of our mandate for the project, we weren't invited to do a rebrand of Transit Windsor. We wanted to work within their existing brand identity, but there wasn't really much to go on. They just had this like 1980s logo, kind of hard to read type, these three kind of people shapes with arrows. So we pulled out from it a circle, a diagonal form, and an arrow. And then we redrew those. So we're like, okay, here's some ingredients. What else is an ingredient? Blue, yellow, green. Great. That gives us enough to work with. So from there, we kind of created this graphic world using that typography, using this like kind of stretchy modular typography, as well as these shapes. And so I showed you on an ad, but you can even do things like this, where you make an infographic timeline out of the shapes. Here's what it looks like on another bus shelter ad, or on social media graphics. We're really leaning into connection between people, or access to work, leaning into, again, the kind of manufacturing identity of City of Windsor. So this was really successful. It drew a lot of input into the process and ultimately led to a new transit master plan. My point on this project is actually it's something that probably you're already thinking about as landscape architects. Elevate what already exists, right? This is my way of saying it. You might have your own way of thinking about it in your own work. So just as you might arrive on a site, and as Nadia was saying, sort of use your intuition to like kind of notice what's there. We do the same thing as graphic designers, immersing ourselves in a brand world, paying attention to what we notice. And then like, even if there's a lot of like things that could be way better, what are those things that are possibilities that we can elevate and celebrate and strengthen? So that's something I'd love for you to think about when you get into creating your own documents or identities for projects. Like, how can you celebrate and elevate what already exists in terms of the Downsview runway area? I'm just going to do a quick pause, just a quick check-in before I transition into the second half of my presentation. Any questions or comments coming up so far?
Any comments so far? I think we can move on. Thanks.
Nadia, is anything jumping up for you?
First of all, I really like the logo that you just had with the transit, taking the three pieces away and repurposing them and reusing them throughout. So subliminally, people kept thinking about that's the brand identity for this transit. So I really like that, especially even with the timeline that you had 2019 from the winter all the way to the summer. I think that works really well. I like these pieces.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks for calling that out.
Yeah, and it actually kind of reminds me like the circle, like the head, and the slash looks like the body. So I think it's like people in movement, right? It's a very clever idea of abstracting those. And abstraction is something that we as landscape architects do from looking at patterns and forms. And so this is something that maybe they can look at even with the pattern of the runway and using that in different ways to design and implement various elements and other wayfinding events on there.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that observation. And absolutely, like abstraction is something that we think about a lot. And then, I always try to balance out like abstraction, but like at what point do you lose the communication? Or at what point do is less always more, or sometimes more is more? So I'm always kind of like asking myself these questions, especially I think as we try to move away from like celebrating like Swiss design as like the only way of doing design, and trying to kind of diversify and decolonize our design canon. It's something I find myself talking a lot about with my talking to my students at George Brown College about like how to kind of embrace all those challenges and those questions. So I want to for the next part of my presentation. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question too? While we're there, I was interested on the City of Windsor project. when you were talking about the like more than transit idea and this question of like how do you make something relevant? And you were talking about you all like transit is about it's helping you do what you need to do, whether that's go to work or see friends. How did you all decide what you were trying to make relevant in that project?
Oh, that's a really good question. How did we decide what to make relevant?
'Cause I
Well,
think that's just, yeah, I
yeah,
guess like in design, I feel like there's so many different where you're like looking at aviation history, for example. Is it about like connecting people to the world? Is it about
yeah,
it's like celebrating industry? Is it like there's so many kind of ways that you can slice
for sure.
relevance,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
yeah.
And probably similar to how you would approach like concepts in landscape architecture, like in brand design, we're also always developing concepts. So often, like within a team, we'll produce several different ideas, like very loose, rough, hone in on two or three that we think are like worthy and like distinct enough to like develop into strong concepts to present to a client. And then from there, like pick one to further explore and refine. So it's not like the only idea that we've kicking around. I think there was other themes that we had were maybe more about the idea of um like not so geometric, but more celebrating like this idea of like all possibilities for like tell us what your thoughts should like tell us your thoughts like maybe using more like fill in the blank and like handwriting stuff. Maybe there's others that were more about celebrating like people. So we explored different things, and ultimately what we landed on was this like the insight here was realizing that like a small percentage of Windsorrites ride the bus, but as if transit improves, so many of them might potentially reconsider it. So as much as we wanted input from people who are already riding the bus regularly, we wanted to position transit as something that might be more relevant to more people, which is why. So we talked about that's why here, like it says, yeah, that point of like we're looking at how transit can support the healthy growth and development of our neighborhoods. And then, again, I mentioned this a bit, but leaning into specific dimensions of that. So this one being really about family, how transit connects to the people we love. And then we use a little bit of alliteration. So we brought in some names of Windsor neighborhoods from Riverside to Roseland. Let's shape how transit connects us to the people we love. We also thought about like the point of people being able to get to work from downtown to Devonshire. Let's shape how transit connects us to the places we work. So it was really through a process of kind of like learning, listening, and bouncing ideas around. And ultimately, that idea of like we need to make transit relevant beyond just like it's not just a thing that like students and low income folk use to get to work. Like kind of like destigmatizing transit at the same time as like we're inviting more input on it. Yeah, you're welcome. So for this next part of my presentation, I'm going to shift gears a bit, and I'm also going to like jump around a bit between tabs because I want to show you some different documents and things that others have created. I'm not actually going to really show you design competitions, often because the stuff that I've worked on is like confidential and can't be shared. But I want to show you things that are publicly available, either as brand identities or as landscape master plans and so on. So these are all projects that I haven't worked on, but I just sort of gathered from peers and friends in the field. So this first one is O2 Planning and Design did this with the City of Mission in BC. It's the Waterfront Revitalization Master Plan. This is their final report. I'm gonna switch into a different view here and go into that tab. All right, can you all see that mission tab? Great. All right. So 86 pages. I'm not going to read it all, obviously, but just to skim through a few things and point out what I see. Um, there's kind of a consistent color palette of like dark blues and light blues. One thing I love about it is like there's these moments of like big renderings, like you put all this work into a rendering, like let it take up the space, let it someone feel like they're there in that world, right? And then clear hierarchy of information where you have like major headings, secondary subheadings, and like tertiary headings. That's also really good for, it's maybe less relevant for a printed document, although it's still useful, but especially if you're ever producing digital PDFs, digital documents such as PDFs, that using that as a proper heading structure rather than just like having different font sizes, but actually setting up in your InDesign file, for example, saying this is an H1 heading, this is an H2 secondary heading, and so on. And that helps assistive technology devices such as screen readers to recognize and for users to use those devices to navigate through content. So I think this document is good for that kind of information. There's these moments of like big renderings with text on top of them, which I think like are a really nice combination where it invites you to like pause and consider the image, but also there's some context there to kind of to draw you in. And then some really nice, I'm not going to get too into like evaluating things from like how landscape architects design plans and renderings, but just to point out sort of as someone who's a bit outside of that field, I like how there's these moments that feel it almost feels like realistic, like it's not just like a very abstract map. It feels more alive, but yet it's annotated with things that really help me make it easy to understand at a glance. So I think I'm just checking my notes. What else did I want to celebrate about that one? Yeah, the color blocking, especially when you move between sections of it. Here's an example of that. What do you mean? So it's almost like a chapter divider page, where there's a moment, like a lot of it's just like white backgrounds and images, but every now and then there's like this moment where it's like a big blue image, and it kind of prompts you to pause and think about that content, or it can be used to signal that you're entering into a different part of the document. So that is that work by O2. I'm gonna move ahead. This next one is the Bentway, the branding and wayfinding. So I do acknowledge that the Bentway's branding has been updated since it was initially created many years ago by Field Trip & Co. in collaboration with Public Work, or the landscape architects. And a few things to highlight here. I'm going to go over to that tab. I'm just on the site of Field Trip & Co., who are the designers behind the identity and the branding.
We actually had Mark Ryan come speak last week. Yeah.
Amazing. I love Mark. That's so great. What a treat. So just to kind of point to the identity for a sec, this is the original Bentway logo. I think the new version is like roughly the same idea conceptually, but it's a little bit different in its implementation. But it was really about embracing the industrial geometric forms, like the bents. Like who knew what a bent was? I didn't. But the bents are like these like structural parts that hold up the Gardiner Expressway. And so I think they did a really good job connecting the name to the physical like environment, especially kind of pairing the word bent with way suggests this, you can travel through it, but it's also a bit of a place. And then bringing that into the logo itself. So kind of having these bents or half pence featured as these main graphic elements, and then kind of applying that at a huge scale in the physical environment, where you take the logo and you put it the logo is even cropped off. Someone might say, "Hey, I can't read the logo." No, you can read the logo. Like you can figure that out. And so it's like part of making it really dynamic and graphic and big. And so just as well as the numbers on the bents, they use like these massive numbers as wayfinding elements that actually become like, it's not just like a little sign in the corner. It's like it becomes part of the experience of the space, like this graphic presence. And also kind of calls out the material contrast, where you can kind of appreciate like the concrete in a different way by seeing these graphic details that draw your attention to it. Smaller signs like this, while I think might have their limitations in terms of like color contrast, especially when the shadows get behind them. From an accessibility perspective, I think they're really great at, again, reinforcing those like industrial engineering elements of the space. So overall, I think this is like really cool work. Even bringing a little bit of poetic mystery into that, which reflects the artfulness of like how this is a cultural programming space as well. So those are my notes on the Bentway's branding and wayfinding, at least the original iteration of it. I'm gonna jump over to another Bentway associated piece. So this is a report called RX, like for prescription for social connection, that was done by the Bentway, Gale Studio, and U of T's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. So this is like a really beautiful document. And what I love about it, it brings in the visual identity of the Bentway. So it feels like a properly branded document. And it seems like they made a very intentional decision. This is going to be like a Bentley branded thing. We're not going to try to co-brand it with like all the identities of these three different collaborators. Um, the typography itself is like really well done, and again, even just the decisions around like what typefaces to use, how to kind of space it closely against images, it reinforces a bit of this idea of like the urban grid, and these industrial forms. Speaking of grids, if you're familiar with like, if you know, I think magazines are a great thing to look at. You'll notice how magazines, especially if they're really well done, things like the New York Times, will have these really beautiful and creative ways of using the grid, where you have, let's say, like 4 columns wide, but then sometimes you have the text kind of in all 4 columns. Sometimes it'll go like half and half. Sometimes like you use 3 of the columns with white space. So you'll see the grid used really evidently in this one, not just horizontal columns, but also vertical columns. I'm just going to go through that PDF quickly and show you a few things that stand out to me. As I mentioned, the color palette being yellow and white and black, really leaning to that Bentley branding. Having these moments of like, it's just text on a colored background, it's easy to read, it's graphic, it invites you to pause, but then having that contrasted against these that are more like immersive, beautiful photos that show like the power of the space. Again, kind of using that same kind of treatment, but with just switching the colors up so it's black. This is one of my favorite examples where we have a little bit of variety. They could have just put like all 4 columns treated exactly the same way, but they created rhythm and like visual interest by having your eye kind of go like this, waving through it. And yeah, other ways of kind of using the grid and breaking up content. I will note, however, that yellow text on a white background isn't good for accessibility because it's really low color contrast. If you're curious later, I can share a tool. My favorite one that I use is colorcontrast.cc as a website. That's color spelled the Canadian way, colorcontrast.cc. And you can put in your foreground or your text color and your background color, and it will tell you whether or not it passes AA or AAA standards. And in general, you want to aim for AA as the best practice at minimum. And that means 4.5 to 1 color contrast. I've probably talked way too much now about color contrast, but that's just to say, just even though I think this is a beautiful, like really well designed report, there are ways that I think that could be further elevated by watching out for those color combinations. All right, let's keep going. Just a couple more to show you. So this is another piece by O2 Planning and Design. This was for a project in Fredericton, New Brunswick called the New Brunswick Exhibition Grounds. And this is a report that covers their public engagement as well as the scenario concepts, which you could think of in a sense of sort of what you might put in design competition. Like, these are our ideas for the space. Now, a lot of this is like follows a lot of really common conventions for like government urban planning engagement reports. And that's fine. I think part of that is just like bringing a lot of clarity to the information. So I think really where this shines is like getting creative with how information is presented. So in this case, this is kind of a really thoughtful analysis of how all the different like dimensions of this space fit together, from a development perspective, from mobility, from thinking about things like schools and community facilities, outdoor spaces. How does it all fit together, and what does that look like? So a bit of like a really rich information graphic, instead of just asking people to take this away from reading a whole wall of text. Again, offering different ways for people to engage and understand information, I think, is a good way of approaching inclusion and communication. And then again, these are very straightforward and not as visually dynamic as that Bentley example, but they're basically achieving the same thing. It's breaking up some key considerations or themes with images that show that. And I like how they've done it kind of 3 sentences per chunk of content. They've made it pretty easy to read. And again, taking like kind of urban planning and landscape architecture concepts and abstracting those in a way that people without that expertise can make sense of them. So kudos to the O2 team for that one. And my final example, this one is hot off the press. Has anyone seen this one yet? So this is a piece created by Canada's placemaking community, which is supported by Canadian Urban Institute with a whole bunch of partners, Bridget McIntosh, Jacqueline West, uh, uh, and others. And this is a book called, or a report called Let's Talk About Placemaking. And I have the PDF version of it here in front of me. Look at that. The cover is just like bright pink with one big word on it. Awesome. And they've used like a funky typeface too. This tells you right off the bat, this is not your conventional boring report on the state of placemaking. This is going to celebrate it and get new people excited about it. And if you think about the power of place as a place for a gathering and even like joy and ideas and fun, it's really playful in its approach. Of course, they're using a 3-column grid here. They have this like serif text typeface for like the smaller text. Then they have these like larger moments where it gets bigger, it kind of expands and bleeds over the images. You know, they're breaking design rules by putting text on curvy lines, which may be challenging for some people to read. That's again a bit of a tension here, but at the same time, it makes the content much more inviting for a lot of people. So a handful of like very bold colors, really green and yellow and pink used throughout. Here they're even using it as a bit of a highlight treatment, messing around with the rotation of text, adding a little bit of a scribble. I think part of this is like I'm guessing here, I wasn't part of the process, but for me, it seems like one of the rules of this was like not, was like breaking the rules. So there's these moments where like you weren't necessarily expecting to have that little moment of delight or a certain graphic treatment. And then there it is. Like, this is, I think, the only page that has like these triangles, but it speaks this idea of bridging the gap. It gives it that clever treatment that you would more often see in a magazine spread than in a conventional report. Another really great thing about this is like, because there's so much great imagery, given the topic of placemaking, they have really leaned into that. And so it's just like a really beautiful, like joyful celebration of placemaking in Canada. And frankly, like makes me really proud to be part of this community. So I think that is the main themes I wanted to pull out there. Let's just double check that list. Yeah, as I said, the playful design reinforces the content. It's got bright colors, combination of large and small type, and those images. Again, in the note of accessibility, I will caution that there's things like this that probably aren't great in terms of color contrast, where you're putting the dark green text over an image that has green and some busy shapes in it, or there's a few other instances of similar treatments, like this one. So I wouldn't recommend it. I do encourage you to kind of do playful things with putting text over shapes and over images, but to be really cautious about balancing that with color contrast, because some folks simply won't be able to read it. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful work. Okay. I've shared a bunch of examples. I'm curious just to turn the mic over to you all for a moment, or anyone who wants to. And so we just chatted about some other examples for a moment, and I'm going to kind of move into wrapping up my presentation. So just some closing thoughts. Kind of summarize a bunch of the things that I talked about in my examples from my portfolio, as well as these other examples from the field. Some considerations you can keep in mind when you're working on your own document design. Brand alignment. So how much are you creating like a new visual identity versus leaning into an existing visual identity of one of the brands, such as YZD or Northfield, Northcrest, I mean. Color. So developing a powerful color palette that gives a memorable look to your piece that is also appropriate for the space and the ideas that you're talking about. Typography. So choosing some typefaces that balance character with legibility, making sure that you have a robust enough type family or font family to use in different contexts, from headings to smaller text. Often I like to have like one or two font families. By family, I mean like a font that has like bold, medium, regular, light weights, And if you have like two, that gives you nice kind of opportunities to pair them together or to contrast them off one another. Like, for example, you have a serif and a sans serif. That's not a rule by any means, but just like an example of how you might work with typography. Graphic devices. So by that, I mean, like, what are the additional supporting graphic elements? If it's like a pattern or a line or some sort of background detail or iconography, what are the supporting graphic elements, those graphic devices that help to kind of act as glue within the visual world that you're building. Balancing text with images or illustrations. So in the examples that I shared, there was a lot of like, there was often a lot of content, but it was made more digestible by balancing those things appropriately, having moments that were maybe just text, other moments that were like just images, and then moments where they come together, which connects a lot to the next couple of points about having a hierarchy of information. Hierarchy meaning sort of one thing is bigger than the other. When you turn the page, you don't necessarily read top to bottom, left to right. Your eye might dart around based on like, oh, what's the biggest image, or where's the infographic drawing my attention, or where's the heading, or where's the pull quote. And so you can create a hierarchy of information through scale and color contrast, as well as how you compose things together in proximity to one another. This also relates to the point of rhythm and pace. So in several of the examples, it's like they've used moments of either changing the color or changing the look of the page to signal that you're entering a different section, or to encourage you to take a moment and pause and absorb that information. And really the point is to also like, you maintain people's interest. If it's all just like a white background all the way through with like 11-point Times New Roman, after a while people are like, oh, there's nothing new coming. Like, and so when you kind of add some variety, you keep the reader's brain wondering like, oh, I want to keep turning the page because maybe I'll have another moment where like it's gonna be different and it's gonna interest me and excite me. Again, not to discourage at all people taking the time to like sit there and read content, but just acknowledging the reality that people will often skim, at least as a first pass, and then to kind of take away the key themes and then decide if they want to get closer to the panel to go deeper, or go back to the start of the book or the PDF and kind of read it all the way through. Another piece here, this is not exactly graphic design, but really part of it plays into it, copywriting and tone of voice. So what are the words that you choose to put on the page? What are the words and sentences that you choose to emphasize by bolding them or making them bigger or brighter or taking up all the page? And you'll see even the examples that I shared, some are more like playful, some are more like direct, some are more bureaucratic and dry while trying to be technical. And so there's not a one size fits all here, but I encourage you to be intentional about how the visuals pair with the words that you choose, so that overall they work together to send the right message. I'm going to leave you 3 kind of further questions to reflect on. 1, as you think about this project, how might you connect the dots between your documents, graphic design, your renderings, and opportunities that exist in the physical space for wayfinding, signage, and place branding? These things are so connected, right? Ideally, your document, the design of the document reinforces and elevates kind of the content of your renderings or your plans, but then also kind of can be a bridge towards how you imagine this being translated into the physical environment. So imagine your concept is chosen, it's going to get built. We're going to like make signs. We're going to like do massive floor murals on like on the pavement. How does that all come together and feel like one cohesive world that you built? How can good communication and design strengthen and bring clarity to the potential of your ideas? This is more of a rhetorical question to think back through all the things that I've posed today as examples. If you're putting a lot of work into your ideas, like help them shine by giving a little bit of love to how they're presented. Finally, how can good communication design help to reduce systemic barriers to participation and make our cities and public spaces more equitable? A lot of these principles that I shared today still apply here, but this is a bit of a different rabbit hole to go down when you're specifically thinking about community engagement processes, which I haven't really talked about very much today. It's been mostly focused on the storytelling around the potential of spaces. And so this is my promo to join me in the pit at the school on Friday, March 21st at noon. So the plan there is for me to again give a presentation and then have some Q&A. There will be, I would say, 10% overlap with what I talked about today, but it's going to be kind of a different talk. So I hope you will find value in that as well. I will leave you with a photo of one of my favorite little murals in Toronto, which is at the Evergreen Brickworks, Tout est possible, which means anything is possible or everything is possible. Of course, this graffiti is sprinkled all over the city. So if you ever see it out in the wild, take a picture and send it to me. Just a reminder that to embrace the possibilities for this project, not only in your ideation around the future of the runway, but also in how you tell the story. Right on. Well, thanks very much. I'm happy to sit